You hear the ground tremble before you see them. 10,000 riders sweeping across the horizon like a living storm. In less than a minute, your world will vanish. Your family torn away, your name erased, your future sold to the highest bidder. For 2 centuries, millions of women were dragged from their homes, paraded through slave markets, and forced into lives that history barely dared to whisper. This isn't just a forgotten chapter of the Ottoman Empire. It's the story of how entire nations bled, how voices were silenced, and how the shadows of that terror still haunt us today. The city had already fallen. Its walls shattered, its defenders slaughtered. But the loudest screams were not from the dead. They came from the living. From the women who realized too late that survival would be their true death sentence. History books still call Suleiman the Magnificent, the builder of mosques, the emperor who humbled kings. But behind the polished marble and the shining domes lay a truth too dark for the chronicles to fully record. What happened after the battlefield was not chaos. It was structure. It was business, a system so calculated that the carnage of war seemed merciful by comparison. The year is 1526. The Battle of Mohacs has ended. Hungary's defenses shattered in a single day. King Louis II drowned in a swamp while fleeing. His knights cut down, his army scattered like ash in the wind. But for the Ottoman army, this was not an ending. It was the beginning of their true campaign. They did not chase the retreating soldiers. Their attention turned to something far more valuable: the civilians. The villages, the women left defenseless on the Hungarian plain. This wasn't random pillaging by wild raiders. Ottoman military records from the 16th century reveal something chilling. The capture and sale of women wasn't a byproduct of war. It was built into the financial engine of conquest. The Akıncı, irregular cavalry, had no salaries from the Ottoman treasury. Their payment came from what they could take, and human beings were the most profitable currency of all. Women became the empire's most valuable spoils, portable, profitable, and endlessly marketable. Even the salaried janissaries depended on campaign profits to supplement their pay. The Sipahi cavalry, who held land grants in peace, looked to war as their opportunity for enrichment. From the top of the hierarchy down to the lowest soldier, everyone expected to profit from human cargo. For the Ottoman war machine, the capture of women wasn't collateral damage. It was policy, an economic strategy, a weapon of empire. Hungarian chroniclers who witnessed the aftermath describe scenes that shattered every romantic image of medieval chivalry. These weren't villages simply looted and abandoned. They were processed, step by step. Men of fighting age were killed outright or chained as laborers, children torn from their parents, separated by gender and age. And the women became inventory, sorted not as human beings but as commodities. Age, beauty, physical strength, fertility. Each trait weighed and assigned a price. This was not chaos. It was a machine. Industrial-level human trafficking disguised as war. Ottoman law itself provided the framework. Islamic jurisprudence allowed the enslavement of non-Muslims captured in battle, but the empire went far beyond the letter of the law. 16th century military regulations specified how captives were to be claimed, documented, and divided. Soldiers filed reports. Commanders took their share. Profits were tallied like taxes. The infamous devshirme system, where Christian boys were seized, converted, and trained as janissaries, was only the tip of the iceberg. For every one boy selected for military service, dozens of women vanished into slave markets stretching from Istanbul to Crimea, to Cairo, to the deserts of North Africa. German and Italian merchants who operated in Ottoman lands left chilling records. They described sorting stations, holding compounds where women were categorized like livestock before being sent to market. The youngest and most beautiful were reserved for Ottoman elites or sold at staggering prices in Istanbul. Older women or those with children were sold cheaply in bulk, destined for farms, households, and workshops. And this was no temporary system. Archaeology shows permanent infrastructure built for it. Stone foundations for barracks, drainage systems, fortified compounds. These weren't improvised camps. They were factories of human misery. From the battlefield to the market, the journey itself was part of the conditioning. Women chained in groups of 10 or 15 marched for hundreds of miles with almost no food or water. The weak were abandoned. The rebellious were executed publicly as a warning. Submission was not requested. It was enforced, mile after brutal mile. By the time the captives reached Istanbul, Bursa, or Kaffa, they were no longer villagers, wives, or daughters. They were inventory, human beings converted into ledger entries. Ottoman commercial records from the 16th century read like cold shopping lists. Unmarried girls, ages 12 to 18, premium price, worth years of a craftsman's wages. Married women with children, heavily discounted, sold in bulk. Older women, priced low, purchased for agricultural estates or menial labor. The markets functioned with the precision of commodity exchanges. Buyers browsed, sellers haggled, clerks tallied profits. The humanity of these women dissolved into numbers, but profit was only half the story. Sexual domination was deliberately weaponized. After a city's fall, Ottoman soldiers were granted 3 days of looting, a tradition that became a theater of horror. Women were systematically distributed among soldiers by rank, first the officers, then regulars, then irregular cavalry. Religious sanctuaries, convents and churches, became special targets. Nuns, women who had fled for safety, were dragged out, their abuse turned into spectacle. To the soldiers, these women were trophies. To the empire, they were propaganda. Their violation delivered a message. Your God cannot protect you. Your priests cannot shield you. Resistance is hopeless. Contemporary witnesses from Europe wrote with trembling pens. Venetian envoys reported the organized selection of captives after sieges, as if women were prizes in a grim lottery. German consuls described entire caravans of chained women, eyes hollow, their fate sealed before they even reached market stalls. And all of it, every scream, every broken family, was calculated. Sexual violence was not random cruelty. It was policy. It rewarded soldiers, funded campaigns, and crushed the will of entire populations. Because what spreads faster than news of a battle lost? The terror of what happens after. Cities heard the stories, and many surrendered before the Ottomans even breached their walls, hoping to spare their women from fates whispered to be worse than death. The Ottomans didn't act alone. Their allies, the Crimean Tatars, turned human trafficking into an industry of their own. Mounted on swift horses, these raiders struck deep into Poland, Hungary, and Russia, not to fight armies but to kidnap civilians. These weren't battles. They were hunting expeditions. Villages burned not for conquest but to flush out captives. Entire communities were targeted, chosen specifically for the number of young women who could be sold. Ottoman tax registers proved the scale was staggering. Duties collected on slave sales revealed that hundreds of thousands of women passed through markets during just a few decades of campaigning. In some regions of southeastern Europe, entire populations collapsed. Villages emptied, never to recover. The devastation is still measurable today. Demographers have tracked population declines that align exactly with Ottoman raids. And modern genetic studies uncover an even deeper scar: forced mixing of populations. DNA evidence shows traces of Ottoman exploitation embedded in Balkan and Eastern European bloodlines, a biological legacy of centuries of abduction, rape, and forced reproduction. But the trauma was not just physical. It was psychological, engineered to erase identity and break spirits. Women were stripped of their names, baptized into new faiths against their will, and severed from every trace of their past lives. A Hungarian woman might wake up in Crimea with a new name, a forced religion, and no hope of ever being recognized by her own family again. And for the rare few who managed escape or freedom, returning home often brought no comfort. Many families rejected them, branding them dishonored, polluted by captivity. Survival itself became another prison. Ottoman records show just how meticulously they maintained control. Military codes outlined punishments for resistance. These were not simple executions. They were performances. A woman who fought back could be buried alive slowly as others were forced to watch. Another who helped someone escape might face days of mutilation. Pain stretched out like a lesson. Fear wasn't an accident. It was part of the system. A system designed to silence resistance, to keep women broken, and to keep the machinery of empire running without interruption. What made this system unstoppable was not just Ottoman soldiers with swords, but merchants with ledgers. Slave traders and financiers worked hand in hand with the military. Merchants often advanced money to commanders before campaigns began, in exchange for guaranteed deliveries of human cargo. Battles weren't just wars anymore, they were investments. The Ottoman army marched with quotas hanging over its head, quotas measured not in territory but in bodies. Customs records from Ottoman ports are chilling in their precision. Manifests list women alongside silks, spices, and grain. One girl, age 15, blonde, Hungarian. 3 women, Caucasian, mid-20s, unwed. These weren't hasty notes scribbled in chaos. They were professional commercial documents, categorized, standardized, and stamped with official seals. And the network stretched far beyond Ottoman borders. Italian banking houses financed raids. Genoese merchants provided ships to carry captives to North Africa. Even Christian kingdoms that thundered against Ottoman barbarity in public quietly dipped their hands into the profits. French ambassadors at the Ottoman court purchased enslaved women as gifts for European nobles. Spanish traders used Istanbul's markets to stock their own wealthy households back in Madrid and Seville. The hypocrisy was staggering. Condemnation from pulpits on Sunday, coin exchanged in secret on Monday. Seasonal patterns turned human lives into predictable trade flows. Spring campaigns in Hungary filled the Istanbul markets by midsummer, temporarily driving down prices. A buyer's season for bulk purchases. Autumn raids in the Caucasus brought fresh captives to Crimea and Anatolia, each region adding new stock to meet different demands. By winter, the routes shifted south, with captives flooding into North African ports where Christian women fetched the highest premiums. It was a system so efficient, so globally integrated, that it resembled a multinational corporation centuries before the term existed. The Ottoman Empire provided the muscle, but Europe provided the money and the buyers. Together, they kept the machine of human trafficking spinning for centuries. For the women at its center, there was no season, no market rhythm, only chains, separation, and the endless question, how many miles until the next auction block? The machinery of enslavement didn't end at the auction block. For many women, the true breaking began after they were sold. Ottoman archives preserve chilling training manuals for slave handlers. They outline a process of conditioning refined over centuries. Sleep deprivation, controlled starvation, alternating cruelty with small rewards. Captives were deliberately isolated from anyone who spoke their language, cutting off hope of solidarity. Within weeks, women were stripped of not just freedom, but identity itself. New names were forced upon them, new languages, new religions. Conversion to Islam wasn't simply a spiritual act, and it was a weapon. Under Ottoman law, a Christian enslaved in battle could sometimes claim release if ransomed. But once converted, she was severed legally and spiritually from her community. She became property, beyond rescue. The empire built permanent facilities to enforce this transformation. Archaeologists have uncovered compounds with segregated housing, sanitation systems, even medical stations. Not for compassion, but to keep valuable property alive. Specialized workshops trained women in skills that would increase their market price: weaving, embroidery, music, or household service. Others destined for sexual slavery were subjected to grooming and cosmetic regimens meant to enhance their value. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure, a system as organized as any military campaign or trade network. Household records from wealthy Ottoman families confirm the dehumanization was total. Ledgers list women alongside expenses for livestock, tools, and household repairs. Notes on their maintenance, way of food, clothing, medical care, appear side by side with costs for feeding cattle. When a woman grew old or ill, her sale or disposal was recorded with the same cold precision as broken equipment. Even hospitals kept files. Physicians documented injuries from systematic abuse, malnutrition, and sexual violence. Yet care was never for mercy, only to preserve economic value. Women were patched up just enough to continue serving, and when they bore children, another layer of exploitation began. Infants born to enslaved mothers automatically inherited slave status, ensuring the system reproduced itself. When children were considered too costly, records describe something even darker: systematic infanticide. Lives ended not out of cruelty alone, but out of cold calculation. The Ottoman raids didn't succeed on brute force alone. They thrived because betrayal was always lurking closer to home. Local collaborators were the hidden gears of this machine. Village elders, priests, even desperate parents sometimes struck bargains with raiding commanders. A single bribe could mean sparing one family while condemning a neighbor. In famine years, some communities offered up their own daughters to avoid mass slaughter. Survival turned people into participants in their own destruction. Ottoman commanders exploited these fractures with precision. Scouts moved ahead of the army, spreading rumors to sow panic. Resistance is futile. Your neighbors have already surrendered. When the soldiers finally arrived, many villages were too divided or demoralized to mount a defense. And when violence came, it was staged with deliberate theater. Captives were paraded through streets, chained in public squares, displayed at crossroads. Women were whipped, not only as punishment but as spectacle, a message to all who watched: resist, and this will be you. Seasonal campaigns became rituals of terror. Each spring, as snow melted, villagers listened for the first thunder of hooves. Mothers taught their children to recognize the sound, to hide in cellars or forests. But hiding was rarely enough. Soldiers burned crops and homes to flush people out, then left blackened ruins behind. A scar meant to remind survivors of the futility of defiance. Psychological warfare spread far beyond the battlefield. Stories of massacres and abductions raced ahead of the armies, carried by fleeing survivors. Ottoman leaders understood that rumor itself could enslave whole regions. Fear alone emptied villages before a single sword was drawn. What made this terror so effective was its rhythm. Year after year, decade after decade, raids returned like seasons. Families rebuilt after one attack only to face another. Children grew up expecting that sooner or later, their lives would be uprooted. Generations lived not in hope but in dread. For the empire, terror was cheaper than steel. A soldier's blade might capture 10 villagers. Fear could capture thousands without a fight. Once captured, women did not share a common destiny. The Ottoman slave system was built on ruthless hierarchy, a sorting process that decided who would live in silks, who would toil in kitchens, and who would vanish into the mud of military camps. At the very top were the concubines. Young, often blonde or fair-skinned women from Eastern Europe were prized for the Sultan's court. They were transported with extreme care, shielded from the filth of mass transport, bathed, perfumed, and trained in etiquette. These women were paraded as symbols of the empire's wealth and power. But their gilded cages were still cages. Every gesture, every word, every glance was monitored. Defiance meant a swift disappearance into the shadows of the palace, sometimes by poison, sometimes by drowning in the Bosphorus. Below them were the women destined for wealthy households. They became cooks, maids, seamstresses, or nannies. Some lived their entire lives in a single home, never stepping beyond its walls. For these women, the chains were invisible, routines of endless work, always under the eye of a master, never free to choose whom to love, where to go, or how to live. The largest group, however, met a far harsher fate: military camps. These women were distributed as rewards to soldiers, often passed around like rations. Life expectancy here was brutally short. Rape, violence, and untreated disease cut lives down within years. They were not meant to endure, only to be consumed. And then there were those deemed low value. Older women, the sick, or those considered unattractive, were sold in bulk at rock-bottom prices. Some were sent to back-breaking labor in fields or workshops. Others, stripped of any market worth, were simply abandoned, discarded like refuse once no profit could be wrung from them. This system was not random cruelty. It was policy, a cold calculus that turned human lives into categories of utility and waste. For the women, it meant waking each day under the same question: what am I worth to them today? For centuries, women were told they had no power in this system, but scattered among the records are whispers of resistance, moments when captives refused to be nothing more than property. Some tried the most desperate path: escape. Chronicles describe women slipping out of fortified compounds under cover of night, disguising themselves in beggars' rags, vanishing into forests or mountain passes. Few survived long. Hunger, patrols, and betrayal by locals often ended their journeys. But even the smallest escape rattled slave owners, a reminder that chains could break. Others fought back from within. One Venetian merchant's diary tells of a group of enslaved women who secretly poisoned their master's wine, killing him and burning the ledgers that documented dozens of captives. Though they were hunted down and executed, their act erased entire records, a victory of silence over bureaucracy. Resistance also came through networks on the outside. Christian churches, especially in Spain and Italy, established vast ransom societies. These groups collected donations from across Europe to buy captives back. Sometimes entire villages emptied their treasuries to free a single daughter. Records show heartbreaking choices, priests deciding which girl to redeem when there wasn't enough silver for all. But ransom was never straightforward. Ottoman traders often raised prices cruelly, knowing families would pay anything. A 15-year-old girl might cost the equivalent of a farm. If the family couldn't pay, the girl vanished deeper into the system beyond reach, and yet some survived. A few ransomed women returned home decades later, aged, scarred, speaking languages their families no longer understood. Others married into the households they once served, using status and cunning to carve out small domains of influence. Even within captivity, they found ways to bend the rules, to assert slivers of control. These stories are rare, fragments against an ocean of despair. But they remind us that resistance was never fully extinguished. Even in chains, even under torture, human beings searched for ways to reclaim their names, their faith, their futures. It was hope, as much as terror, that kept this system alive. Hope made families pay. Hope drove escape. Hope, cruelly exploited, was both weapon and lifeline. When the hooves finally stopped pounding, when the slave markets of Istanbul, Cairo, and Algiers began to fall silent, the damage could not be undone. Centuries of trafficking had carved scars so deep that nations are still living with them today. Entire regions were depopulated. In Ukraine and southern Poland, travelers rode to villages where only the elderly remained, the young and strong stolen away. In the Caucasus, generations of women disappeared into Ottoman harems and households, leaving behind ghostly family lines that simply ended. Whole languages dwindled because mothers who would have passed them on were taken, silenced in foreign courts. Demographics shifted. Some areas became lands of widowers and orphans, while Ottoman cities swelled with foreign-born populations who had been uprooted against their will. The genetic legacy of these women lingers in Istanbul's old neighborhoods and Mediterranean port towns, in the faces of descendants who may never know the stories behind their ancestry. Culture, too, was reshaped. Folklore across Eastern Europe is thick with warnings to children. Don't wander into the fields, don't stray near the river, or the raiders will come for you. Songs, lullabies, even prayers absorbed the terror of centuries. Generations grew up with trauma encoded in their lullabies. Fear passed down as tradition, and memory itself became contested ground. Some nations buried the stories, ashamed of centuries of vulnerability. Others mythologized them, turning tragedy into symbols of resistance. But the women at the center, the millions trafficked, broken, bought, and sold, rarely left behind their own words. Their stories survive mostly through ledgers, ransom records, and the boasts of the men who exploited them. This silence is perhaps the greatest theft of all. Not just lives, but voices erased. And so remembering them now is not merely history, it is justice. Because the Ottoman slave system was not an isolated horror of the past. It was one of the largest human trafficking networks in history, a machine powered by greed, betrayal, and complicity across empires, and its echoes remain in the demographics, folklore, and fractured memories of nations today. The raids ended, the markets closed, but the shadow still walks.